Thank you, Kane.
Are you back on? Yeah.
Yep, I'm back on. Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I also would like to acknowledge that we meet today on Whadjuk Noongar land and to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people as the original owners and spiritual custodians of this country. Now, it's been very interesting being the last speaker, so what I want to do is, I realise that what I'm going to be talking about, some other speakers have intervened in beforehand, and some interesting points that are raised in there, so I'll try and refer to them. Ian made some particularly interesting points about where Western Australian artists might be looking to develop their practices. What I'm thinking about is no matter what they do, we want to make sure that they are visible. And so I'm going to be talking specifically about the way in which West Australian artists working from this place, really need to be seen in a national and international context. Okay, well, the tyranny of myopia distorts and fragments our understanding of the breadth and the depth and the diversity and the scope of Australian cultural life. Despite our interconnectedness through radio and TV and the internet and all the wonderful things that Nicola's just been talking about, I still claim that the coverage of arts and cultural activities in this country is viewed from a very, very close focus, which corrupts our understanding of the terms Australian or national when it's used in the context of contemporary art in this country. There are an embarrassingly large number of books, newspaper articles, television and radio programs and curated exhibitions which have been produced over the past century that have egregiously used the prefix Australian to describe some aspect of visual arts practice on this continent when they exclude any reference whatsoever to Western Australian artists, galleries, institutions, or at best they only provide a very desultory footnote. In the past, the excuse for such carelessness was time or distance or expense. But in a period in which we have access to a plethora of rapid communications options, these justifications will no longer suffice. Retrospectively, curators and critics have often acknowledged that they were remiss in omitting artists, events or works held in public collections in Western Australia for their so-called national surveys. But the documented evidence remains, and it impacts significantly on the artists who choose to live and work in this place. Now, most of our media agencies, and I do acknowledge all the good work that ABC is doing, but the print and SBS, the print media, journals and magazines, The Australian, The Monthly, Art and Australia, and to a lesser extent Art Monthly, Eyeline and Artlink, have only a cursory interest in the activities outside the Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra and more recently Brisbane axis. Admittedly, as I said, the ABC have produced that fantastic series of short docos on Western Australian art, and their radio coverage has always been excellent, and I do agree that ABC Online is fantastic. Congratulations. The Australian also covers activities in WA, led by Vicky and her colleagues, of which I am one. But in terms of the activity across all areas of engagement within the arts, we have to agree, I'm sure you agree, that the coverage is basically cursory and always hard-won. For example, in 2013, PAF and the Cultural Precinct decided it would be great to be on a program called Studio, run by SBS, the national broadcaster. We had to pay airfares and accommodation for that person to come across to get coverage. Now that is not acceptable. Even when we're competing against South Australia, sorry Lisa, in the weekend review of art activity in the Australian, the reporting is embarrassingly out of kilter. Look at these sample pages from the Weekend Australian over the past 6 months, where the red is Western Australia and the blue is South Australia. Frequently less than a quarter. And this is this last weekend. This was this weekend, the worst of all. How many of you wrote to the editor of The Australian saying that this was an outrage? Please do next time. Have a look. So where does this dismissive mindset originate? Positioning Western Australian art practice within the larger narrative of Australian and international art is a complex activity, admittedly. It negotiates a pathway through national and international issues of cultural dependency that have constructed a centre-periphery model of cultural influence, which Ian referred to. Since the 1970s, there's been a great deal about debate about the relationship to world culture and perceived provincialism problem, good old Terry. As a result, Australia has often been positioned at the periphery as a marginalised community defined by its relationship to the centres of world art. This dependency theory of cultural activity is exemplified in the adoption of the invidious cultural cringe that's haunted Australian artists since it was first enunciated in the 1950s by Arthur Phillips. Although Phillips thought this a positive influence that would enable Australian artists to measure their achievements against universal standards, thus protecting them from the evils of parochialism, its popularity as a form of denigration caused him to write a rebuttal in the 1980s. It is within this dependency model of cultural production that non-Indigenous Australian visual culture has been previously defined as either a pale imitation of imported models or as a series of unique variations inflected with an Australian accent. Seen within this model, the West Australian arts practice is even further marginalised. It is peripheral to the periphery and dislocated from both Australian and world centres of art production. Over 20 years ago, Ian Byrne, Nigel Lendon, Charles Merriweather and Anne Stephen challenged this view in their important book, The Necessity of Australian Art, in which they stated that an alternative interpretation of Australian art should be able to reveal the interdependent, not dependent character of the relations between centre and periphery, in such a way that it's possible to glimpse through Australian art an alternative interpretation of 20th century art. In their extrapolation of how this might be achieved, they proposed an alternative model for examining the contribution of Australian artists working outside the centres of international culture. Central to this model was an examination of the relationship between the national forms of traditions and the international form of the art market, and a re-evaluation of local traditions and practices. They argued that within this framework of uneven exchange, the cultural value of regional practice is denied. And in response, Byrne and his colleagues called for a re-evaluation of local traditions and practices. In particular, a re-evaluation of the distortions and the different understandings overlaid upon a historically specific social environment. Indeed, the visual culture of Western Australia documents a local response to international and national issues that by its very presence not only contributes to the larger history of Australian visual culture, but also offers a distinctive perspective to that larger narrative. For Aboriginal artists, it's often a process of strengthening culture through reflection and reimagination. And for non-Indigenous artists, it can be a mechanism for establishing a sense of belonging. Out West has a deserved reputation as a hedonistic environment, but it's also harsh, unique, and biodiverse. The extraordinary landscape and ecology demands a response, and artists find a way to inflect received knowledge with their experience of living here. Yet while a great deal of Australian art was brought for public and private collections in Western Australia through the gallery and through private collections, and exhibitions of work from Sydney and Melbourne were held frequently in Perth, the exchange has not happened. There are few exceptions, with a very limited number of works by Western Australian artists purchased by national major collections and included in major survey exhibitions. The exceptions are, as Ian pointed out and others, Aboriginal artists, many of whom have been acknowledged nationally and internationally. For example, Rover Thomas, who represented Australia at the Venice Biennale in 1990. Distance, freight costs and invisibility are the obvious reasons for the reason that there have been other exhibitions and critical evaluations that haven't inhibited inclusion of West Australian artists. This was an exhibition that Ian mentioned in 1961, the recent Australian painting, which was held at the Whitechapel in 1961. And it included works by 4 West Australian artists. In large part, this was because the federal government provided funding support to bring Brian Robertson, the curator, the director of the Whitechapel Gallery, to Australia, including Western Australia, to visit artists, to see their works, and to make his selection at first hand. Just as Lisa is here at the moment looking at West Australian artists. Now, no one wants to put a quota on it, but we do want, at least when there is a national exhibition or a biennale or a survey, for people to say, well, we came, there was nobody there that we wanted to include, but at least we came and we are working from a solid base of information. Thank you, Joe. 6 years later, John Stringer, curator of the famous Field exhibition, in which, of course, Trevor was included, and he gave us a very good example about how that happened, because he was in his studio in Melbourne when John came to visit. But John acknowledged that had he known the work of Howard Taylor, he would certainly have been included. Unfortunately, there was no travel budget to go outside Melbourne. There was no money to visit Perth or Adelaide, Hobart or Brisbane. How different the history of Australian art might have been if Howard Taylor, who came from a very different approach to hard-edge abstraction, Howard would never seen it that way, that might have been a very, very different marker in the history of Australian art. The exclusion of Western Australian artists from publications surveying national trends or activity was another consequence which has exacerbated this situation. All history, as Raymond Williams suggests, involves a selective tradition that requires acknowledgement of the processes of selection to determine how those decisions are made. Whether in the widest field of Australia art, as it is relation to international practice, or seen solely within Australia, the selective tradition is not constantly examined, can skew interpretation, mystifying and obscuring the complexities of these relationships and the contributions of those on the periphery. The writings of Ian Byrne and his colleagues was driven by the belief that the need for a new understanding of regional values in Australia and of their historical basis in Australian culture was not simply a question of historical accuracy or of elucidating the role of influential regional practices on the development of Australian art, but it was a necessary condition of contemporary understanding and practice. Well, as Nicola said, the recent television series The Art of Australia, presented by Edmund Capon, and its complement Hannah Gadsby's Oz, offered a blinkered view of Australian art practice that seemed to end at the 129th meridian east longitude. Capon included one artist from Western Australia, Rover Thomas, but Gadsby failed to acknowledge any creative activity outside the state's border. And unfortunately, it is this recorded history that remains. These videos will be shown to students in high school over coming decades, and this myth will be cemented in the mindsets of generations of gallery goers, critics, curators and art historians who will, due to this erroneous rewriting of history, perpetuate the myth of regularly replicating Capon and Gadsby's oversights. Once again, the exception is the work of Aboriginal artists from Western Australia, as you mentioned, Nicola, who were reasonably well represented in Hetty Perkins' wonderful series, Art and Soul. Now, a brief scan of the major publications over the past half-century, claiming to be a history of Australia, highlight the slippages, the omissions and the exclusions. Bernard Smith's Australian Painting, published in 1962, lists just 3 West Australian artists, Guy Gray Smith, Robert Juniper and John Lungi, whom he claimed were actively at work seeking to forge a personal style for themselves relevant to time and place. 4 years later, Robert Hughes in The Art of Australia also listed 3, though Herbert McClintock and his alter ego Max Ebert, perhaps there were 4, replaced John Lungi. In 1997, Christopher Allen's Art in Australia listed only 2 artists from Western Australia, Brian Blanchflower and Carol Rudyard, while Andrew Sayers included 3 West Australian artists, Axel Poignant, Kate O'Connor and Howard Taylor, in his Australian Art, published in 2001. Most recently, Sasha Grishin's Australian Art History has done better, with 15 artists based in Western Australia included in his index. They are Brian Blanchflower, Julie Dowling, Florence Fuller, Robert Juniper, Paddy Chavandji, Rover Thomas, Herbert McClintock, Kathleen O'Connor, Chris Peace, Shane Pickett, Guy Gray-Smith, Howard Taylor, Henry Van Raalte, Harold Fike and George Pitt Morrison. And there were also 4 comments about practice and experience in Western Australia. But with the exception of Grisham, this lack of rigour has skewed the interpretation of our cultural history and generates a displaced consciousness, while also mystifying and obscuring the complexity of these relationships and the contribution of those on the periphery. Now, the same is true of media-specific surveys or thematic studies of Australian art. Vicky mentioned the recent mid-century modern Australian furniture design at the National Gallery of Victoria, which omits any reference to David Fuchs Taylor, who was such an important figure in this state in building a furniture industry, looking at design, bringing together influences from Europe and also from America and from the Bauhaus. Yet there is no mention of David Fuchs Taylor. If it were truly a national coverage, it should be. He should be there. So what can we do? I've just been moaning, I know. I can't help it. But there's really no point in moaning, no point back of hand to brow. It hasn't worked in the past and it's not going to work in the future. So I'd like to propose a few suggestions that might impact on this invisibility. Firstly, to ensure those writing, selecting, filming and purchasing are made aware of what is happening here, we should be looking at establishing a local arts production unit, which could work with the ABC. So often it's because the material isn't available that it doesn't get shown. But the universities, the DCA, Screen West, there's a lot of opportunity to cover the activities that don't get covered, would be available, could be put up on YouTube, could be available to Fairfax, to the ABC, to the Australian, to other outlets that would make us a lot more visible. A number of people have mentioned publications, and they are a vital part of the new word, ecology, of our sector. For so few Australian artists, let alone West Australian artists, have a monograph on their work or a substantial catalogue that situates their practice and provides curators, collectors, scholars and television and radio documentary makers with the information that they require. One of the key areas that would make a significant difference in building the national and international profile of artists living here is to support the publication of substantial catalogues, books and monographs. And I know that ArtSource are doing that with a project. The galleries have been doing it for some time, but there is a lot more that could be achieved. In addition, we should encourage all cultural agencies, universities and the DCA and the AusCo to create programs like a reverse art flight grant that will bring critics, journalists, academics or promoters who are proposing a project that might include a West Australian artist to this state. That's another great reason that we've had this forum, because Lisa is here now. She's able to see what is happening here while she's making decisions about her forthcoming exhibition. Freight and travel, though, remain the inhibiting factor, and an adjunct program that would provide immediate quick response funding to artists who are invited to be in these exhibitions would be fantastic. But finally, the responsibility lies with us all. Western Australian artists, curators, collectors, directors, performers and musicians should be proactive in sending their updates, catalogues, links to websites, etc. With the internet, there really is no reason that projects should remain hidden from consciousness any longer. It's quite possible to have a wider audience for your projects for things that happen outside Fitzroy or Surrey Hills. And we should also be looking, as has been mentioned, and as you probably know, there is a project to look at generating some activities which will bring international interest here, that will showcase what's happening in Western Australia alongside international artists, so bringing the world to WA. In the 21st century, and this is just a very short list of some of the things that I hope we will consider in the future, because I think these are the things that will make a difference. So in the 21st century, when we say Australian, when we're talking about our culture, or when we invoke the epithet national, it must be used with accuracy to embrace what is happening in all states and territories, in all major cities, and in all remote communities. Thank you.